from Arizona.
I raise a point of order under Rule 28 that Section 32205 exceeds the scope of conference for the conference report to accompany H.R. 22.
And, Mr. President,
The senator from Oklahoma.
I move to waive the point of order raised under the Rule 28, that Section 32205 of the conference report to accompany H.R. 22 exceeds the scope of conference.
The waiver is debatable.
Mr. President,
Okay.
The senator from California.
if I could just be heard for 30 seconds or less, please don't, because if this passes and we don't waive the point of order, this bill is gone. The House bill didn't even have an extension. So if this bill goes down, we have no highway system. Please vote with Senator Inhofe and myself. It is urgent.
The senator from
Mr.
Oklahoma.
President, both sides have agreed to have 5 minutes equally divided. How much time did the senator from California already take?
Seconds.
All right, I recognize Senator Roberts for 45 seconds.
Mr. President,
The senator from Kansas.
I rise to address the point of order raised against the highway bill. Among the many provisions of the bill, the legislation realizes a commitment made by House and Senate leadership to restore egregious, harmful, counterproductive, contract-breaking cuts to the federal crop insurance program. The commitment we reached with the House was to reverse these damaging cuts and policy changes in order to protect our producers. That's their number one priority for risk management. The message from farm country couldn't be more clear. Do not target crop insurance. The point of order would not only strip out much of the needed crop insurance fix, but it could also prevent the timely
The
passage.
senator's time has expired.
Mr. President,
The senator from Oklahoma.
I'd like to recognize the junior senator from Arizona, Senator Flake, for such time as he wants to use of his 2.5 minutes.
The senator from Arizona.
I thank the senator. What we're doing here is targeting a specific provision that was airdropped into the highway bill. This isn't an attack on the highway bill. It's an attack on a provision which increases crop subsidies $3 billion over what is in the budget deal. Now, we are often accused in this body of reversing cuts that we make before the ink is dry. In this case, we actually made a deal to reverse the cuts before the ink was even put to paper. Now, if we're ever going to get serious about controlling our deficit and addressing our debt, then we've actually got to stick to some of the cuts that we've made. That's what this point of order is all about. I urge support of it.
The senator from Oklahoma.
Recognize the senator from Michigan, Senator Stabenow, for 15 seconds.
Thank you very much. I just rise to support the transportation bill and crop insurance. We made a deal with farmers when we gave up direct subsidies that instead we would ask them to have skin in the game and have crop insurance to manage their risk. They have a 5-year bill that gives them certainty. We should not pull the rug out from under them
The
at
senator's
this time.
time has expired.
Thank you.
So, Mr. President, recognize the senator from Kansas, Senator Moran, for 30 seconds.
The
Mr.
senator
President.
from Kansas.
Mr. President, I rise in opposition to the point of order and ask my colleagues to support the crop insurance program. In Kansas, the weather is not always our friend. The most important farm program that farmers benefit from is the crop insurance program. We've eliminated other farm programs over a long period of time in the name of reform, but have them replaced by crop insurance. Now crop insurance becomes the target. I yield.
Okay, Mr. President,
Senator from
recognize
Oklahoma.
the senator from New Hampshire, Senator Shaheen, for such time as she needs to use from her side.
Thank you, Senator Inhofe. I will be brief, but I think it's important to challenge the provision in this legislation. I support the highway bill. I think the Negotiators did a great job to get us a 5-year bill, but the fact is this provision was not included in either the House Transportation or the Senate Transportation bill. It is an indefensible reversal of the bipartisan budget bill that became law less than a month ago. It is a $3 billion giveaway to the insurance companies, and I think we need to challenge this kind of move when it gets dropped into a bill.
For final. That's good. Yes. And I'd ask the chair on the proponents and opponents the time remaining.
The senator from Arizona has a minute remaining. The senator from Oklahoma has 15 seconds.
Mr. President, let me just end by saying this is not an attack on the highway bill. It has its own issues, but this provision simply attacks the subsidy here, the $3 billion subsidy that was added back in after we had agreed in a bipartisan way to these cuts. We cannot continue to go back on the cuts that we've made. And in this case, we didn't even wait a month or 2 months. The agreement was made on this floor before the bill was even passed. We've got to get away from that kind of practice. And so I would urge support for this point of order, and I would yield back.
Thank you. Mr. President, let me just make sure everyone understands what we're doing here. The Budget Act of 2015 had major cuts in the federal crop insurance program. Some of those were restored in the highway bill. Now, if the highway bill is changed, if this should pass, it has to go back to the House, which means we could not have it this year. In other words, the issue here is not whether or not how you feel about crop insurance. It's whether or not you want this bill. I suggest that 65 members that are here today voted for the bill. It would be very difficult to explain how you could vote for the bill and turn around and vote for the very order against it that would kill the bill for this year.
The senator's time has expired.
2015. That's it. Has to vote. There you go. Go.
Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be. Is all time yielded back? The clerk will call the roll. The clerk will call the roll on the motion to waive.
Mr. Alexander, Ms. Ayotte, Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Bennett, Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Blunt, Mr. Booker, Mr. Bozeman, Mrs. Boxer, Mr. Brown, Mr. Burr, Ms. Cantwell, Mrs. Capito, Mr. Cardin, Mr. Carper, Mr. Casey, Mr. Cassidy, Mr. Coates, Mr. Cochran, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Mr. Corker, Mr. Cornyn, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Daines, Mr. Donnelly, Mr. Durbin, Mr. Inzie, Mrs. Ernst, Mrs. Feinstein, Mrs. Fisher, Mr. Flake, Mr. Franken, Mr. Gardner, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Mr. Hatch, Mr. Heinrich, Ms. Heitkamp, Mr. Heller, Ms. Hirono, Mr. Hoven, Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Isaacson, Mr. Johnson, Mr. Kane, Mr. King, Mr. Kirk, Ms. Klobuchar, Mr. Langford, Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee, Mr. Manchin, Mr. Markey, Mr. McCain, Mrs. McCaskill, Mr. McConnell, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Ms. Mikulski, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Nelson, Mr. Paul, Mr. Perdue, Mr. Peters, Mr. Portman, Mr. Reed of Rhode Island, Mr. Peters, Mr. Portman, Mr. Reed of Rhode Island, Mr. Reed of Nevada, Mr. Risch, Mr. Roberts, Mr. Rounds, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Sass, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott, Mr. Sessions, yes, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Sullivan, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Tillis,
I'm a no. I think I mistakenly.
Mr. Udall, Mr. Vitter, Mr. Warner, Ms. Warren, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Okay. Senators voting in the affirmative: Alexander, Baldwin, Barrasso, Bennett, Blumenthal, Blunt, Bozeman, Boxer, Brown, Burr, Cantwell, Capito, Cardin, Cassidy, Cochran, Collins, Cornyn, Daines, Donnelly, Inze, Ernst, Feinstein, Fisher, Franken, Gardner, Grassley, Hatch, Heitkamp, Hirono, Hoeven, Inhofe, Isaacson, Kane, King, Kirk, Klobuchar, Langford, Markey, McCaskill, McConnell, Merkley, Mikulski, Moran, Murphy, Murray, Nelson, Peters, Roberts, Rounds, Sass, Schatz, Stabenow, Sullivan, Tester, Thune, Tillis, Vitter, Whitehouse, and Wicker. Mr. Scott? Aye. Mr. Wyden? Aye. Mr. Udall? Aye. Mr. Heinrich? Aye. Mr. Casey? Aye. Mrs. Shaheen? Senators voting in the negative: Ayotte, Carper, Corker, Flake, Gillibrand, Lee, Manchin, McCain, Perdue, Shaheen, Warner, and Warren. Mr. Paul, aye. Mr. Durbin? No. Mr. Cotton? Aye. Mr. Menendez? No. Mr. Booker? No. Mr. Rubio? Aye. Mr. Leahy? Aye. Mr. Crapo? Aye. Mr. Risch? Aye. Mr. Reed of Rhode Island? No. Mr. Graham? Aye.
I voted aye on this one.
Mr. Sessions?
I voted yes.
No.
I'm going to vote no.
Mr. Heller? Aye. Mr. Coates? Mr. Coates? Aye. Mr. Portman? Aye. Mr. Johnson? Aye. Mr. Cruz? No. Ms. Murkowski? Aye. Mrs. McCaskill? No. Mr. Shelby? Aye. Mr. Toomey? No. Mr. Coons? No. Mr. Shelby? No. Mr. Reed of Nevada? No.
Did he switch to no?
Mr. Cruz? Aye.
Are there any senators in the chamber wishing to vote or change their vote? If not, on this vote, the yeas are 75 and the nays 22. 3/5 of the senators duly chosen and sworn having voted in the affirmative, the motion is agreed to.